The eyes of the lady depicted on this piece of fabric are literally alive. Well, yes, when the scientists looked at the eyes through an ophthalmoscope, they were shocked to realize that the iris reacted to light just like your eyes would. Okay, I'll come back to the scientists' exact conclusions a little later, but you'll see that you're really not at the end of your surprises. You may think this is nonsense, but today it is not for nothing that this piece of fabric is one of the greatest mysteries of all time for science, and hundreds of scientists around the world continue to study it. Because yes, in fact, the strange eyes of this lady are just one element among the 10 others that still have no explanation to this day regarding this image. So welcome to this series where we look at the 100 greatest unexplainable mysteries in history according to science. And today for our 10th mystery, I have something very, very heavy planned for us. Get comfortable, and let me tell you why this image has intrigued the whole world for a century. We are in 1929 in Mexico. Mr. Alfonso Marque Gonzalez, a professional photographer, was invited to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe to take photos of a cloth that the Basilica treasures. This fabric, 1 meter 70 tall and 1 meter 5 wide, depicts the Virgin Mary. Well, so far, nothing special. It looks like an old painting that dates back several centuries. Alfonso takes the photos and goes home. But when he enlarges some negatives of the face in the image, he discovers the reflection of a bearded man in the eyes. Alfonso is the first to see this, but he doesn't know it yet. This is just the beginning of a long series of surprising discoveries. At the time, almost no one pays attention to the photographer's statement, and it takes a few more decades for things to pick up speed. On May 29, 1951, a Tunis G. Carlos Salinas Chavez in turn discovers, using a high magnification lens on a photo of the cloth, that there seems to be a bearded man in the right eye of the image. He soon finds him in the left eye as well, but positioned just slightly differently, almost a bit off. Strange. In any case, this time the information is making waves. The Catholic authorities, who hold the cloth, are informed, and they then request several experts to analyze the fabric. Here are the names of about 10 scientists, mainly ophthalmologists, who studied the eyes of the lady in the following years, along with the dates they conducted their studies. We have kept all their written reports, and it is based on these reports that this investigation is conducted. Here is a French excerpt from one of these reports, for example, that of September 20th, 1958 by Dr. Toria Lavoignet. First of all the ophthalmologists confirm the presence of the bearded man. But that's nothing compared to the 3 things he discovers next. The first discovery is that the eyes conform to the laws of optics. Well, let me explain. The reflection in the left eye is not the same as that in the right eye. Well, yes, if a real bearded man were reflected in real human eyes, there would logically be a difference in position. The reflections located in the corner near the nose of one eye would necessarily be found in the corner near the ear of the other eye. Are you following along? Well, here, that's exactly what's happening. Even more intriguing, the distortion of the reflection corresponds to the normal curvature of the cornea. And that's not all. Some ophthalmologists, like Dr. Jorge Escalante Padilla, even noted the presence of the normal microscopic venous network, which is perfectly visible on the eyelids and the cornea of the Lady of Guadalupe's eyes. You understand, the realism of the image is shocking. So far, this is already very surprising because the eyes are actually extremely small on the cloth. They measure barely 7 to 8 millimeters in diameter, so less than 1 centimeter per eye. How could someone have managed to paint reflections that are less than half a millimeter on such coarse fabric? And above all, how could he have thought to slightly shift the reflection to make it conform to the laws of optics? Scientists have tried to reproduce this painting on identical fabric. But even with the finest brushes we have and today's techniques, they haven't succeeded. The surface is too small, too coarse, too rough. Now, on top of that, this hobby would date back a few centuries, but we'll get back to that. In short, okay, all of this is nice and all, but actually it's absolutely nothing compared to what's coming next. There's a law in optics called the Purkinje-Sanson law. It was discovered in the 1830s. It consists of this. When an object is at a certain distance from an eye, neither too close nor too far and well lit, it reflects not just once, but 3 times in each eye. The first time at the surface of the cornea, the second time behind the lens, and the third time between the first 2 images. And this third reflection is inverted compared to the other 2. The top ends up at the bottom and vice versa, and it's smaller. Now, all the consulted ophthalmologists were able to spot the 3 images of the bearded man in each eye in accordance with the laws of optics discovered in 1830. Except that the craziest part is that the 3 reflections from the Purkinje-Sanson law can only form in the open eyes of living people, actually showing the depth of a human eye with a cornea and a lens. and with a lens that is not just a simple drawing of a lens, but actually has an anterior surface and a posterior one, so it has both relief and depth. Basically, I don't know if I'm being clear, but we've never been able to observe these reflections on flat surfaces, whether it's paintings or simple photos. However, the image of Guadalupe is just a simple canvas, perfectly flat. This simple fact alone, when discovered, left all the ophthalmologists stunned, because they all know that these three reflections can only be found in living eyes. But I told you there were three major discoveries in the eyes. And in fact, the scientists were really not done with their surprises. The second major discovery was, as I mentioned, that the eye reacts like a living human eye when observed under the light of an ophthalmoscope. Ophthalmologist Rafael Estatus Tobella explains, when you project the light from an ophthalmoscope onto the anterior part of the eye, the iris shines more than the rest, not the pupil, which creates a sense of depth, along with the impression that the iris is about to contract at any moment. Here's another explanation given by Dr. Raphael Torilla-Lavoignet. When you direct the light from the ophthalmoscope onto the pupil of a human eye, you see a bright reflection shining on the outer circle of it. When directing the light from the ophthalmoscope onto the pupil of the eye in the image of the Virgin, same bright reflection appears. And as a result of this reflection, the pupil illuminates diffusely, creating the impression of a concave relief. This reflection is impossible to achieve on a flat and moreover opaque surface. I later examined the eyes in various oil paintings, watercolors, and photographs using the ophthalmoscope. On none of them, all featuring distinct characters, could we see the slightest reflection, while the eyes of the Virgin of Guadalupe give an impression of life. But it's probably the third most incredible discovery by the ophthalmologists, in the truest sense of the word. It's really hard to believe this last discovery took place during a long phase of study and research that lasted from 1979 to 1997. During this period, captivated by the first discoveries they had already made, some ophthalmologists wanted to continue analyzing the eyes in the image to see if they could find anything else. As technology improved, they were gradually able to enlarge the image more and more, up to 2,000 times. And this then allowed the discovery of reflections of no less than 12 other people in the eyes of the Virgin. Dr. José Astetonsman was the first to look into this. The colored spots you see are the different figures he identified. Well, like that, I have to admit it's not very convincing, but what convinced the ophthalmocs wasn't just simple spots. It was, as Dr. Tunsman puts it, finding the corresponding reflection in the other eye, in the position it should normally occupy according to the laws of optics, along with the normal distortions at that second position. A theory then begins to emerge. All these figures that are reflected in the eyes would be the people present at the moment when the image miraculously formed on the fabric several centuries ago. Well, I think I've lost you there. So let's go back in time a bit, because a piece of the puzzle is found in the past. In fact, this fabric would date back to the 16th century. Alright, I'll tell you everything, and you'll understand in a moment why there are 13 people in the eyes of the Virgin. It is Saturday, December 9th, 1531. In this Mexico, which was then deeply marked by the recently concluded Spanish conquest, Juan Diego, 57 years old, is a former Indian who has recently converted to Christianity. That day, Juan Diego left his home in Tulpetlac, and he intended to go to Tlaltolco to visit his new Christian friends, the Franciscan priests. He is very impressed by their way of living very poorly, and at least twice a week, he walks 15 kilometers to continue his religious education and attend Mass. But that morning, after crossing the mountainous area of the Sierra, passing near the hill of Tepeyac, he suddenly hears the beautiful song of birds, a song more beautiful than any he has ever heard. It seems to be coming from the top of the hill of Tepeyac. Suddenly the song stops. Great silence. Juan Diego, very surprised, waits for a few moments, on the lookout. It is then that he hears a very soft voice calling him by his name and even by his nickname, as is often the custom in Mexico.
Juanito, beloved Juan Diego.
The voice seems to be coming from the top of the hill. Very intrigued, Juan Diego steps forward to find out who is calling him like that. He then sees a very young woman, very gentle and very beautiful, who simply tells him that she is the Virgin Mary, mother of the true God. Just that she speaks to him in Nahuatl, his mother tongue, an indigenous language of the Aztecs. Juan Diego is struck by the beauty of the woman and feels deeply loved. All moved, he kneels as if he feels he is in front of an important person. The woman tells him that she wants to entrust him with a mission. She wants him to go see the bishop in Mexico. In the Catholic Church, the bishop is the head of an entire territory made up of several churches. The woman invites Juan Diego to go and ask the bishop in her name to build a church right here where she can reveal God and give him to the people, listen to their cries, their sorrows, heal them, and cure all their pain. Then the woman disappears. Juan Diego, overwhelmed by the beauty of the apparition, has a feeling that what he saw is genuine. Without hesitation, he immediately sets off, arrives in the city, and goes to the center, to the bishop's house, which is gone today, but whose exact location is known, near the old Omayor temple in Mexico. But you can't just walk in on the bishop like that. Juan Diego has to wait a long time before one of the servants comes to take him to see him. The bishop, Juan de Zumárraga, doesn't speak a word of Nahuatl. During the meeting, there is a translator, Juan González, who acts as a link between Juan Diego and the bishop. Juan Diego starts to tell his story, but pretty quickly the bishop cuts him off and tells him to come back another day when he has more time. Basically, it lasts 5 minutes, then bye, thanks, see you, I have better things to do. Juan Diego clearly understood that the bishop didn't believe a word of his story, and he leaves a bit disappointed. Well, I know so far you don't see the connection with the image of the lady with the strange eyes, but that's coming. Juan Diego thinks he needs to go directly inform the Virgin that his meeting with the bishop was a complete failure, so he heads back to the hill, arriving as night falls. And indeed, the lady appears again. Juan Diego allows himself to say that she would be better off sending someone more noble, respected, or honored to the bishop because he is just a man from the countryside. In short, our brave Juan Diego thinks he's not the crispiest chip in the bag. And when I say that, I'm echoing his ideas, since he defines himself as the last in the village. He is a humble man who doesn't think of himself as important and doesn't seek recognition. But the lady replies to him,
It is absolutely necessary that it be you, my son, you the smallest, and I give you the task to go see the bishop again tomorrow.
Well, let's be honest, personally, I would have stopped there, but Juan Diego, he bows and promises the beautiful lady to fulfill her wishes. The next day, around 10 a.m., he sets off to go see the bishop again. He is incredibly determined. When he arrives at his palace, he has a hard time getting to see him, but eventually, a second audience is granted to him. So he throws himself at her feet, crying, and tells her again his whole story and the very strong desire of the Holy Virgin for a small church to be built at the foot of the hill of Tepeyac. This time, Juan de Zumárraga takes his time, asks him a lot of questions, scrutinizes him to form an opinion on his sincerity, and half convinced, tells him to ask this lady to give him a sign if all of this is true after all. Well, Juan Diego is happy. It's already better than the day before. At least there's a bit of hope. He then asks the bishop to choose the sign he wishes. It is now Tuesday, December 12th, 1631. The lady appears to Juan Diego again at the same spot and asks him to climb to the top of the hill to gather all the flowers he finds, then to come back down, to show them to her, and finally to take them to the bishop. Flowers on December 12th, even in Mexico in winter, when it freezes like that day, only brambles and stones grow. Well, stones don't grow, but you get the idea. So, if he brings flowers to the bishop, Juan Diego thinks it will surely be a striking sign, indeed. He climbs to the top and, very surprised, he will later testify that he was filled with admiration at the sight of so many flowers of all kinds, blooming, their petals open, beautiful and delicate. Well, he picks them and goes back to see the lady. She takes a few of them, then places them back in the fold of her cloak. Because yes, it's important to know that Juan Diego is wearing a kind of cloak or poncho that the Aztecs used to wear, made of woven agave fibers, which was called a tilma in Nahuatl.
The lady then places the flowers in the tilma, saying to him, My youngest son, these varied flowers are the proof, the sign that you will take to the bishop.
Juan Diego arrives again at the bishop's palace. He tells the whole story again, the thing with the flowers, and at the end he unfolds his cloak. The flowers fall to the ground, and to his great surprise, the bishop also falls to the ground, kneeling before him. Juan Diego doesn't quite understand why the bishop has knelt before him, but after a few moments, Juan Diego realizes, on his cloak, the image of the Holy Virgin has been imprinted, hands joined, her head gently tilted. Ah, here it is. The connection with what I was telling you at the beginning. Here it is, the famous cloth that bears the image of the lady with the strange eyes. The bishop who sees this image is completely convinced this time. He then takes Juan Diego's cloak, who leaves without it. Poor guy, out of luck. Soon, Juan Diego is invited to show the place where the Virgin appeared to him. A spring emerged from the rocks. Then, in just about 15 days, the first chapel is built. Today, it is probably the largest Catholic pilgrimage site in the world, with between 20 and 30 million pilgrims visiting the basilica each year. Well, it's all very charming, but we have no proof that this story is authentic. And that still doesn't tell us who the 13 people are that we see in the eyes of the Virgin. First, what shows that this story wasn't made up afterwards? Well, in fact, we have more than 100 archival documents dating from before 1700 that talk about this apparition at Guadalupe. Some documents date back even a few years after the events. Starting from the 18th century, the documents pile up to the point that it's no longer possible to count them. The Bolton Guadalupano Bulletin has been trying to publish all the facsimiles of these archival documents for several years. The oldest document that has come down to us dates back to 1537 and is signed by the hand of Bishop Juan de Zumárraga. Another document, a poem in this case called The Song in Wool, which probably dates from those same years, has come down to us. A passage from the poem addresses the Virgin Mary and says, "God created you among abundant flowers and repenned you again, Holy Mary, before the bishop." In 1570, here's another poem in Nahuatl, of which here is an excerpt. "Our Lady of Guadalupe is the great miracle that our Lord God chose to accomplish through the ever-Virgin Holy Mary." Well, the venerable image of the Mistress and Lord is right there. Miraculously, on the tilma of the poor little man, his venerable painting has appeared. Now there she is with all her worldwide fame. In short, you get the idea. I'm not going to read them all to you, but a more interesting document is probably the Codex 1548 or Codex Escalada. It's a document that dates back to 1548, as its name indicates, and it contains a few words in Nahuatl, but mostly a large drawing. Now, even though the parchment has certainly deteriorated over time, you can still clearly recognize a representation of the apparition, with Juan Diego on the left and Mary surrounded by an oval, just like on the tilma in the upper right. Graphologists, that is to say, people who study signatures, have been able to identify the signature of Brother Bernardino de Sahagún and confirm the date of 1548. There is no doubt that the events of Guadalupe and the apparition of this strange tilma date back to the 16th century. But still, even back then, it could be a complete invention, and the image could simply be a painting made by Juan Diego himself or by another forger. Well, that's exactly it. Scientists wanted to get to the bottom of it. Is this image a painting, yes or no? Today, the scientists' response is unanimous and no longer up for debate. Already, everyone agrees that paintings older than a few decades usually show cracks caused by the drying of the paint. Here, none, but above all, the scientists who studied the image under a microscope never found the slightest brushstroke. Yet, no matter what painting technique is used, unless you're doing Jackson Pollock, the application of color always leaves streaks. If you find that surprising, wait for what's next. In 1936, three scientists, Ernestos Odi Palares, Fritz Hahn, and Richard Kuhn, who would win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry 2 years later, studied two fibers from the tilma. Their conclusions indicate on these two fibers, one red and the other yellow, there are no plant, animal, or mineral dyes. I don't know if there's anything that shocks you, but in fact, when we remove from our planet everything that doesn't fit into these three categories, there's not much left. Well, apart from mushrooms and viruses, right? Unfortunately, the analysis protocols will never be revealed. We only have the conclusions, but anyway, this result will be confirmed later. Starting in May 1979, when Jody Brand-Smith, a Master of Arts from the University of Miami, and Philip Cerner Callahan, a biophysicist from the University of Florida and painting expert, both NASA scientists, began to examine the tilma. Callahan is very surprised by the blue color on the fabric. He explains, "We are faced with an inexplicable phenomenon here because all these blues are semi-permanent and known to fade considerably over time, especially in hot countries. On the contrary, the blue of the Virgin's cloak is of equal intensity, unfaded, made of a semi-transparent blue pigment, unknown, as bright as if it had been applied last week." But as he continues to analyze the tilma, it's ultimately the pink of the dress that seems the most mysterious to him. According to him, there is absolutely nothing on earth that can produce such a pink, as you can see in the explanations he provides, which I've put in French on the screen. But what intrigues scientists even more is the strange preservation of the colors on the tilma. Indeed, the image did not benefit from the protective measures that we see today in all museums for ancient paintings. The exhibition rules in museums today for any ancient painting are summarized like this by Ernesto Sodi Palares, a metal specialist and professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. There must systematically be 60% humidity, a constant temperature, ventilation, examination to prevent the formation of microorganisms, checking for the absence of sulfur compounds, subdued lighting, X-ray analysis, photography in ultraviolet and infrared light, etc. Of course, as you might suspect, the image of Guadalupe did not benefit from any of these conservation techniques for nearly 5 centuries. But above all, it was continuously venerated by the faithful who came to touch the image, caress it, kiss it, rub it with their clothes, and so on. We know for sure that for the first 116 years, the image was directly exposed to the sight and touch of the faithful. Starting in 1647, a first glass pane in 2 pieces was installed, but it was regularly removed, as evidenced by the painter Miguel Cabrera in the 18th century, who also confirms that many objects were rubbed against the tilma. The openings of the glass were not supposed to happen every day, but it must have occurred many times over the course of more than 200 years. In one single instance in 1753, while I was present, 500 images passed before my eyes that touched the fabric. Then various high-profile ecclesiastical figures spent more than 2 hours on this pious exercise, This painter also created a depiction of the apparition, which you see here. Remember it well because we will talk about it again. Today we know that the tilma is made of IXTEL or maguey fibers, which means it's made from agave. Now this fabric is usually extremely fragile. And then after all, even if it had been more solid, it's worth mentioning that a very large number of touches leave marks. This is what we call mechanical wear. Just look at the foot of the bronze statue of St. Peter in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which has become completely smooth after centuries of being touched by the faithful. And that's not to mention the temperature variations. Weather changes in the very humid region. But there is something even more improbable. While in museums, these works are displayed in dim light, the image of Guadalupe was subjected for centuries to the close radiation of thousands of candles. Scientists measured the intensity of ultraviolet light emitted by a single candle, the most common type used in churches, and found a radiation of over 600 microwatts. Now, if we multiply this result by the hundreds of candles placed on the altar of a small chapel very close to the image without the protection of a glass that would partially filter this ultraviolet radiation, it's hard to understand how the image could have even survived. Indeed, excess ultraviolet rays quickly fade most pigments, whether they are organic or not, especially the blues. It's a bit like a photo left near a sunny window that fades in just a few years. Basically, the image should have completely disappeared after so much time. And scientists therefore consider the excellent state of preservation of the tilma to be inexplicable. Finally, here's the last interesting element that rules out the possibility that the image is a painting. In 1947, European technicians from North America and Mexico took photos of the image of Guadalupe from distances ranging from a few centimeters to 3 meters. All obtained very different colors, which cannot be explained by handling errors or technical failures of the equipment. In the close-up photos, the Virgin's face appeared pinkish gray. In those taken from further away, it appeared greenish gray, and infrared rays revealed yellow radiations. This has been continuously verified since then. Now, the phenomenon that comes closest to this is iridescence, like on bird feathers, butterfly scales, or beetle elytra, and it's completely impossible to achieve with paint. This might explain the observation made by researcher José Arnauzen, who, while examining the lips of the image under a magnifying glass, noted with surprise that there is no precise outline and that the line fades into colors and lights. In short, with all these surprising elements, the absence of brush strokes, the pigments of unknown origin, the colors that have perfectly preserved over several centuries, and the iridescence, scientists were able to make a decision to answer the question we were asking earlier: is it a painting that could have been made by a forger? Well, here's their conclusion. What they know for sure is that this image is not a painting made by a human using the traditional methods that could have existed in the 16th century. What they still don't know today is how the image on this tilma could have formed. Some people think that it's an image made without human hands. Well, if you don't know what it is, you can give a little like and subscribe, because I've taught you a word that might come in handy at your next fancy dinner. An image made without human hands, simply put, is an image that wasn't created by human effort. But then, is that the case for the tilma of Guadalupe? Basically, is the version I told you earlier about Juan Diego credible? Could it be possible that this image was supernaturally imprinted, like in the original account that has been circulating since 1531? If science doesn't know how the image was created, and if the eyes of this image are truly alive, then this theory doesn't seem so crazy after all, and it could very well be the most likely one. And indeed, a discovery could confirm this theory. The image seems to emanate light. When photos of the tilma were taken in dim light, yet without a flash, it was found that the colors were brighter, and the photos were overexposed, which is completely counterintuitive. So, some scientists even think that the image might be some sort of hologram. Well, exactly, and in fact this image would be something completely unique that doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth, but the word hologram is what comes closest to it. Well, to really find out if this image couldn't have been made by human hands, let's move forward, because you're in for more surprises. First of all, let's go back to the 13 figures that are present in the eyes of the Virgin. In fact, according to some specialists who have studied the tilma of Guadalupe for years, the profiles of these 13 figures could resemble the small gathering, including the bishop, that was present at the exact moment when Juan Diego dropped the flowers from his tilma. You might be wondering how it's possible for scientists to put forward such precise hypotheses when the figures are barely a few millimeters each, or even less. And you're right to be asking that. But in reality, thanks to enlargements up to 2,000 times, scientists have been able to observe many details about each individual. For example, they noticed that this person, who is 3.3 meters tall in total, seems to be carrying a bag on their back, probably a calabash for carrying water. This person has long hair, which seems to be tied up with a string that knots it at ear level. But upon closer inspection, you also notice that he has an earring, a small ring with a pendant that he wears on his lobe. This ring is clearly visible under the microscope, and yet its size is barely 1/100th of a millimeter on the tilma. Finally, you can even see that he is wearing sandals. The width of the strap that holds it has even been measured. It measures 12/100ths of a millimeter. The earring, the long hair, the sandals, all of this suggests that this figure is likely an Indian, perhaps a servant of the bishop. But here's another example. There is another figure of which we only have the face, which can be seen quite clearly in the left eye, and it measures 1.6 millimeters on it. You can easily see that the features correspond to the image of an old man with a fairly pronounced baldness. He has some hair that could suggest a tonsure. The nose is also large and especially straight. In the right eye, you can also see the reflection of the shape, but much less distinctly, in accordance with the laws of optics, which include a slight shift. The cheek, whether due to age or some illnesses, is gaunt and accentuates the right cheekbone. A tear seems to be flowing down the cheek towards the corner of the lips. The jawbone is prominent, firm, rigid, and covered with a splendid white beard. Well, okay, interesting. But do you remember that depiction of the apparition that I showed you earlier? Do you remember? It dates to the 18th century and was painted by Miguel Cabrera. The way he depicted Bishop Juan de Zumárraga immediately brings to mind the old man seen in the eyes. Old, bearded, bald. It's not far-fetched to assume that the artist may have drawn inspiration from portraits of the time that no longer exist. Indeed, the Aztecs quickly became excellent artists, and it's likely that they wanted to depict the miracle of the roses based on the accounts of witnesses and the descriptions from the Bishop of Mexico. In the eyes, we see another person, perhaps resembling an indigenous person, because he is wearing a strange hat. Some think that it could be Juan Diego. Again, here are the faces found in both eyes, with their relative positions, just like on the corneas of a living person. It's quite striking. We also see a black woman who measures 0.7 millimeter in the left eye. Here too, it's not some wild speculation from scientists extrapolating from insignificant spots. No, because the same figure can be found in both eyes, depending on its relative position to the reflection. At first, scientists were amazed by this discovery. But in reality, we now know that Hernán Cortés brought black slaves to Mexico. And here's a piece of information that researchers have found, and it really seems astonishing. In the History of the Church in Mexico by Father Mariano Cuevas, it is written that Bishop Juan de Zumárraga granted freedom to a black slave who was in his service in Mexico. Here is the text. I declare that I free and emancipate from all submission and servitude Marie, a black woman, and Pedro, a black man, her husband, who are my slaves, so that as free persons they may dispose of themselves as they wish. And then, even crazier, we were able to find the boarding document of Bishop Zumárraga from Spain to Mexico, and we found the mention of the black slave among those who accompanied him. I'm not going to go into detail about all 13 characters, but to wrap it up, I can show you this group of people. It looks like a whole family. In the left eye, you can make out a woman with a baby on her back, a man in a sombrero who is watching her, a child between these two figures, and then 3 people behind the young woman, another child, a woman, and a man. In the right eye, we can even see one more child. This group of characters fascinates scientists because it is not the same size as the others. In other words, it's the only one that doesn't follow the perspectives. But it also has the particularity of being present, not just on the iris, but on the pupil. Now, if the iris reflects what is there at the moment a person is photographed, the pupil reflects more precisely what the person was looking at that moment. Does this group of people, whom the Virgin is looking directly at, represent all of humanity as if there were a hidden message to decipher? Anyway, you got the idea. All these characters are, of course, impossible to paint by hand, as they are all ridiculously tiny. But above all, they are all placed in both eyes, in a relative position, in accordance with the laws of optics, and in particular the Purkinje-Samson law, which was only discovered in 1830. So it really seems that we are dealing with a completely inexplicable mystery, because it is strictly impossible for a human to have created this image in 1531, and even today, in fact. So after all, since we have no scientific hypothesis to explain the image on this cloth, what if Juan Diego's account was true? That could explain quite a few things. The eyes of the image that react to the iris, reflections of the eyes, vivid colors, that's certainly Rose A's hypothesis. Statesman, it is impossible to explain the presence of the tiny portraits through natural processes. Consequently, accepting the impression of the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe as a supernatural fact, I dare to argue that at the moment Juan Diego was received, the Virgin Mary was present, invisible to the eyes of those who were there, but seeing the whole scene herself, and as a result, receiving in her eyes the reflected images of all the attendees, including Juan Diego himself. When he unfolded the tilma and the flowers fell, the image of Our Lady was imprinted on it, just as she was at that moment, meaning she had the reflection of the entire group of people who were watching this historical event in her eyes. In this way, the Virgin Mary wanted to leave us a snapshot of her miraculous impression on Juan Diego's garment. Well, if that were all, okay, that would have already been pretty good. I could have stopped the investigation here, told you to form your own opinion, asked you to subscribe for support, and then said thank you and see you next time for another inexplicable mystery, right? But actually, no. There's even more, much more. With this cloth, scientists have gone from surprise to surprise. This fabric is a true challenge to the intellect, a real enigma that continues to astonish, and the more you delve into it, the more new things you discover, each more impressive than the last, to the point that it becomes a genuine passion, and some have dedicated their lives to studying this image. So let me show you 3 additional discoveries, the 3 most astonishing findings that scientists have made so far, in addition to the eyes. I hope you're holding on tight. First discovery, on the Virgin's cloak there are 46 stars. Well, starting in 1980, researchers compared the arrangement of these stars to an astronomical map to identify any possible constellations. In 1980, it wasn't easy to access the mapping of the sky as it was on any given date and any location on the globe, like we can do today with just a few clicks on the internet. But after a certain amount of unproductive research, scientists were surprised to discover that constellations were indeed present and in the correct order. But they were found reversed, as if you were looking at them in a mirror, or as if you could, somewhat like God, observe them far out in the universe, on the opposite side of the Earth. On the other hand, a discovery that seemed strange because the star projection on the Virgin's cloak showed a slight distortion of the constellations. The degree of distortion was more or less significant depending on the location of the star on the cloak and the angle of projection. To establish the correct correspondence between the distorted constellations on the cloak and the constellations of the celestial vault, Hernández Illescas, an astronomer, had the idea to use a concave mirror, and there, everything fit together. In fact, he realized that the constellations were slightly compressed and distorted, as if by the effect of projecting a concave sphere onto a 2D plane. It's like with world maps that try to represent a sphere. So, the closer you get to the polar regions, the more pronounced the distortions of the continents become. It was the same here for the constellations that appeared. But taking this distortion into account, the surprise was significant. The position of the constellations corresponded precisely to the sky, as it could be observed at 10:40, in the morning on December 12, 1531, at the exact place and moment of the presumed apparition. Moreover, it was exactly the day of the winter solstice, which is the precise moment of the arrival of the new sun that the Aztecs had been eagerly awaiting. The constellation of the Virgin is then at the center of the image, at the point of the double knot of the Black Belt, and, notably, the constellation of the Northern Crown is right above the forehead of Our Lady of Guadalupe, as if perhaps the Virgin wanted to show that she is a queen in the sky. In any case, these initial studies were conducted between 1981 and 1995, but in the 2000s, with technology having advanced significantly, other scientists like Fernando Ojeda Llanes, in collaboration with Dr. Gabriel Góngora Biaki, wanted to verify these results using the latest cutting-edge techniques in astronomy. And by comparing the constellations as visible in the sky at the exact location of the apparition on December 12, 1531, at 10:40, they obtained a result of over 90% correlation between the constellations in the sky and the 46 stars on the Tilma. Researchers also analyzed over 150 other paintings from the 17th and 18th centuries depicting the Virgin Mary. Stars, and not a single grouping of stars matched any constellation. In short, it's up to you to form your own opinion. But the only certainty we can have is that in the 16th century, no forger could have created an image showing the constellations as they were in the sky, at the exact place and moment of the presumed apparition. In fact, things seems to be left to chance on this Tilma. The 46 stars are divided into 2 identical groups, 23 on the left and 23 on the right. Some say that this is reminiscent of the 23 pairs, chromosomes in human body cells. Okay, I can understand if this seems a bit far-fetched to you, but on the other hand, scientists are right to think that nothing is left to chance on this fabric. Indeed, it was also discovered that the proportions of the Tilma perfectly adhered to the divine proportion. Well, you're probably thinking, what is this? Let me explain. And then we'll move on to the 2 other astonishing discoveries made by the scientists. The idea of divine proportion, or golden ratio, a concept that dates back to antiquity, is quite simple. It's as simple as that. The whole thing is divided into 2 parts A and B, the ratio of the larger part A to the smaller part B. A over B is equal to the sum of the 2A plus B over the larger A, so A over B equals A plus B over A. Easy, right? Okay, well, I've lost everyone. No, it's ubiquitous in nature, art, architecture, and implying simply that length is 1.618 times width. 1618, and with other decimals after the decimal point. That's what we call the golden number. And unconsciously, well, our brain really likes it, and everything that respects this proportion, it finds aesthetically pleasing. Now, the tilma exhibits this divine proportion everywhere, whether it's in the dimensions of the fabric, the dimensions of the oval, and so many other details. But anyway, let's move on, because you might say that this isn't really inexplicable, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But it was still interesting to note we are faced with a cloth that indeed leaves no room for chance. And now, here's the second astonishing discovery made by the scientists. There are a bunch of patterns on the Virgin's robe, but what interests us are 9 flowers in particular, which experts in Aztec pictograms call tepetal flowers. And tepetal in Nahuatl means mountain. Some people had the idea of overlaying a topographic map of Mexico with the image of the tilma. Well, I think you're like me before I learned this, and you don't know what the word orography means. Well, here we go. After the phrase, "Welcome to the little chicks, ladies and gentlemen," here's a new word for your fancy dinners between the cheese and dessert: orography. If you knew these 2 words before this video, you are literally a genius and you should immediately participate in Questions for a Champion. Well, orography comes from the Greek oros, which means mountain, and graphia, which means writing or description. So orography is the description of mountains. The scientists wanted to compare a topographic map of Mexico with the tilma, but they had to choose the scale of the map and a reference point to position this map of Mexico on the image. The search began, but very quickly. Weeks followed days, months followed weeks, and years followed months. The lead seemed to yield nothing, until mathematician Fernando Oreda had a brilliant idea. Oreda knew that the stars on the cloak corresponded to the constellations of the winter solstice, a celebration that was particularly important for the Aztecs. The Virgin Mary, if it really was her who left her image on this cloth, wanted to immerse herself in Aztec traditions, starting with the fact that she spoke to Juan Diego, a converted Indian. Now, the most important celebration for the Aztecs was the New Fire Festival. This festival only took place once every 52 years, so there's no need to tell you how important it was. And it was celebrated on the Hill of the Star in Mexico, about 20 kilometers away from the Hill of Tepeyac, the site of the apparitions. Oreda then had the idea to place the main flower on the Hill of the Star. This flower that is on the Virgin's belly is the Nahui Olin of the Aztecs. It's a 4-petaled flower that represents the 4 directions of the universe in Aztec traditions, the 4 cardinal points. And there, by placing this flower on the Hill of the Star, everything became clear. On the flower placed at the neckline of the dress, you can locate the Malinche volcano, which is 4,503 meters high. The flower placed on the right sleeve of the dress coincides with the Papayos volcano, which is 3,640 meters high. The flower that is on the left sleeve of the dress corresponds to the Popocatépetl volcano, the 2nd highest volcano in Mexico, which rises to 5,452 meters. The flower located near the main one indicates the Hill of the Apparitions, which is situated at 2450 Memu. In short, we also find the Jocotitlan volcano, which has an altitude of 3928 meters, the Monte Alto, a mountain structure made up of 3 volcanoes, and the snow-capped Toluca volcano, which stands at 4690 meters. Moreover, in relation to the tilma, the orographic map was then oriented precisely with the east upwards, towards the head of the Virgin. Now, the east was the most important cardinal point for the Aztecs, who always looked towards the rising sun, and Quetzalcoatl, their feathered serpent deity, was prophesied to return from the east. 8 out of the 9 tepetal flowers correspond very precisely with one of the main mountain ranges in Mexico. But then, what does the 9th flower indicate? Well, as you can see, the research is not over. In science, we constantly keep digging deeper, trying to understand, and that's what's happening with this image. In reality, we're just at the beginning, and as the years go by, more discoveries keep piling up. Maybe if I redo this video in 10 years, scientists will have discovered many more things by then. For example, some would have seen a reflection in the eyes of Juan Diego, who, I remind you, is himself reflected in the eyes of the Virgin. Basically, a reflection in the reflection, a mystery within a mystery. Others might have heard, through a stethoscope placed at the Virgin's belly, a heartbeat at 115 beats per minute, which corresponds to the heartbeat of a newborn in its mother's womb. But none of this is confirmed for now, and we shouldn't let these kinds of unproven things cast doubt on all the other well-documented elements that I've talked about throughout this investigation. All I want to show you is that we are still far from fully understanding this image, as it is a striking well of enigmas that, when solved, lead to new ones. So yes, there are still so many things, I assure you, that I don't have time to talk about here. So for those who want to know more, feel free to read these 3 books that I relied on to conduct this investigation. Well, after the star map and the volcano map on the tilma, here is the 3rd discovery by scientists that is now well established. But first, let's change the music to set a different mood. Okay, that's great. We've already talked about the connection between mathematics and the tilma, as all the proportions in the image perfectly adhere to divine proportions, mathematical proportions that can be found in nature. Now, We have known since ancient times that there is also a link between mathematics and music, as the musical scale can be represented in a mathematical form. Thus, the mathematician Fernando Redalanés had the following idea. If on one side the stars and flowers on the Virgin's cloak and dress have a meaning and are arranged in a precise mathematically proven order, and if on the other hand music and mathematics have a close relationship, then the likelihood of finding a musical logic in these symbols is high. The golden rectangle that the tilma is on was thus divided into 46 equidistant lines, just like the number of stars. This then forms a musical score. And as you can see in the image on the screen, the stars and flowers are automatically placed on these lines, like notes on a musical score. And the horizontal distance between the different symbols in the image was used to establish the tones and rhythms. You can then play the score from left to right or even backwards. It's Alberto Aguilar Portillo, a knowledgeable musician who helped with the research and was the first to play the musical sequence. So, what does this music sound like? Is it at least pretty? Well, I'll let you be the judge, since you've been listening to it for over a minute. As you might guess, in what you're currently hearing, an arrangement has been made for the beauty of the melody. But still, it is indeed the exact score that can be found in the image of Guadalupe. I know that musical tastes are very subjective, but I find it beautiful. Is it just a coincidence? Go ahead. Try placing random notes on a score and see it's nearly impossible to achieve a beautiful harmony and something that doesn't sound off. And then, if that were all, but no, as you've seen since the beginning of this investigation, the surprising elements in the image of Guadalupe number in the dozens. And what if with all this, it was really God who wanted to send us this image? But what would the message be? In fact, we need to remember the context of the apparition. The Aztec people had never heard of Christianity. He practiced human sacrifices and was very far from the message of love from Jesus. Yet, Jesus wanted his message of love, joy, and peace to be spread all over the earth. It's his last phrase recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Teach them to observe all that I have commanded you, and I am with you always, to the end of the age." Old Aztec prophecies foretold Quetzalcoatl would come from the east. When Cortez arrived in Mexico, the emperor thought it was him, so he invited Cortez to reclaim the throne. Princess Papanzin, Moctezuma's sister, had a vision. That's how he invited Cortez to reclaim the throne he had kept for him during his absence. But even more impressive, Princess Papanzin, the Emperor Moctezuma's own sister, had an extraordinary vision. She had nearly died. They had already placed her in the tomb when her cries called for help. She then recounted that she had an out-of-body vision and saw many large ships arriving on the sea with black crosses on their sails. The princess was informed that these ships were bringing men from a distant land who would conquer the country and announce the true God to the Aztecs. This is indeed one of the essential points of the message of the Virgin of Guadalupe.
From her very first words, she introduces herself to Juan Diego as the perfect and ever-virgin Holy Mary, Mother of the one true God.
In the heart of an Aztec people so far from the message of Christ, the Virgin of Guadalupe says to Juan Diego,
"I am truly your compassionate mother, yours and of all of you who are one on this earth. There I will listen to their cries, their sorrows, to heal them, to cure all their pain, their misery, their suffering."
She shows her compassionate face that reflects the loving face of God. And in her eyes, she carries them on. And indeed, this apparition had such an impact that the conversion of Mexico to Catholicism was rapid. To the point that even today, nearly 5 centuries later, 80% of the Mexican population identifies as Catholic. Maybe that's why God wanted to protect the image through the centuries and prevent its decay. Ah yes, by the way, I had saved that for the end. In reality, there's one last surprising fact, because the image has remarkably withstood not one, but 2 events that clearly should have destroyed it. In 1791, while cleaning the silver frame of the miraculous image with a solution made up of 50% concentrated nitric acid and the same amount of water, a bit of this liquid accidentally dripped onto the canvas itself, more specifically on the upper right corner when facing the image. According to specialists, such a liquid on such a fragile plant canvas should have caused considerable damage and even puncture the canvas. However, that was not the case. Only a yellowish stain appeared, and in a completely inexplicable way, it is now slowly disappearing over the years. Another incident made quite a stir, pun intended or not. It was on November 14th, 1921 at 10:30 the morning when an attack took place in the Church of Guadalupe. A worker named Luciano Perez placed a bouquet of flowers in front of the altar above which the miraculous image was displayed. He then quietly exited the basilica, but a few minutes later, a loud explosion shook the entire building. In the bouquet was a bomb. The damage was enormous. The marble steps of the altar shattered. The candlesticks, flower vases, and windows of the church, even those of the surrounding houses, burst. That shows the power of the bomb. a heavy brass crucifix was completely twisted by the explosion. You can still see it today in the Museum of the Apparitions, but the glass of the image of Guadalupe didn't budge an inch. You don't necessarily have to shout miracle for that. Some believe that the altar itself acted as a barrier between the bouquet and the miraculous image, and that the destructive waves were thus deflected. It doesn't matter. Still, the image withstands the test of time and all kinds of incidents, and maybe that's not for nothing. One might think, since it defies science on all points, that God perhaps wanted to preserve it to give scientists in the centuries to come the joy and surprise of discovering all the wonders he had hidden within it, like a time bomb of mysteries. To summarize, here are the 12 elements that, to this day, remain inexplicable about this image. Stay tuned until the end because I have something important to tell you afterwards. First, there has been no alteration of the fragile cloth over 5 centuries. Secondly, the fact that there are no brush strokes. Thirdly, the pigments of the colors are of unknown origin. Fourthly, there has been no discoloration over 5 centuries. The colors still look fresh and there are no cracks. Fifth, the iridescence of the image and the fact that it produces light when photographed in dim light. Sixth, the Virgin's eyes react to an ophthalmoscope like living eyes. Seventh, the presence of blood vessels in the Virgin's eyes. Eighth, tiny figures that are reflected in the eyes, which would be impossible to paint by hand. Ninth, the reflections of these figures in both eyes are positioned according to the laws of optics. 10th, the stars on the Virgin's mantle that form the constellations visible in the sky at the exact place and time of the apparition. 11th, the flowers on the Virgin's mantle that correspond to the mountains of Mexico. 12th, the stars and the flowers that form a partition. And as a bonus, the divine proportions on the Tilma and the cloth that withstands accidents and attacks. Well, all these 12 inexplicable elements together make up only the nth inexplicable mystery in our series of 100. So subscribe so you don't miss my upcoming investigations on the next 90, and go check out the 9 previous ones that are already out. Third and final thing is, if you want these videos to keep coming out, improve in quality, and even increase in frequency, a big thank you for supporting the channel monthly. Even from just €1 or €2 a month, it helps us a lot and ensures the sustainability of our mission. So thank you in advance to everyone who will do it. All the links are in the description. That was Ines. Bye.